Bonjour, good afternoon. My name is Nandini Ramanujam and I am the Executive Director of Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism. It is my privilege to welcome you to the concluding conversation in our first series of dialogues on human rights and pluralism. The theme for today is realizing economic justice, and I am excited to be with two of my colleagues who have rich and unique perspectives on economic justice. To my left, I have Professor John Unruh from the School of Geography. His research, applied and policy work over the past 20 years has focused on the human geography of war-affected countries. His particular interest is the recovery of war-affected land and property rights. His experience includes work in war-affected countries of Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. He has occasionally worked with the United Nations, donors, and a variety of governments to build land and property rights system in the context of post-conflict transition. To my right, I have the pleasure of having my colleague from the Faculty of Law, Professor Allison, who holds the Stikeman Chair in the Law of Taxation at the faculty here at McGill University. Her research and teaching focuses on national and international tax law and policy issues, with emphasis on the relationship between taxation and economic development and the role of government and non-government institutions and actors in creating tax policy norms. So we have Professor Christian, who's a lawyer. We have Professor Unruh, who is a development geographer, and myself, I'm trained as an economist, so this is going to be an interdisciplinary conversation on economic justice. My own interests include law and development, institutions and governance with a focus on economic justice, food security in particular. I'm delighted to be part of this very timely and important conversation. Two stark phenomena and statistics dominate my consciousness as I put my thoughts to this session. One, the recent warning from the World Food Programme that 14 million people are at risk of starvation in Yemen. If we include conditions in South Sudan, northeastern Nigeria, and Somalia, the number rises to over 20 million people facing acute hunger and malnutrition. This man-made humanitarian crisis is particularly complex as it is not just the states, but many non-state actors are responsible for the catastrophic events. John's insights from his work on land and barriers to justice in post-conflict and conflict regions would be pertinent to this conversation. The other shocking figure is one of child stunting, which is extreme malnutrition. 24% of 667 million children under the age of 5 are so undernourished that they suffer from irreversible cognitive and physical damage. In the world where equality of opportunities and rights discourse dominate the academy and policy circles, indelible inequalities are printed in the brains of these children. They will never have a level playing field, no matter what rights they possess. Over the past 2.5 decades, we witnessed the fast-paced growth and economic transformation, with China alone pulling over 500 million people out of extreme poverty. India also has made big gains in poverty reduction, yet at the same time, we have seen rise in extreme inequalities within and across countries. 1% of the global population owns 45% of the world's wealth. And then there are 4 billion people in the world who are subject to precarious existence without the protection of law. Globally, the Millennium Development Goals generated new and innovative partnerships and showed immense value of setting an ambitious agenda. While more than 1 billion people have been lifted out of extreme poverty, Mostly thanks to the success of two large countries, India and China, and inroads have been made against hunger, and more girls than ever before have been able to attend schools. Inequalities persist and progress has been uneven. The Sustainable Development Goals have embraced a more inclusive development agenda, and each of its goals calls for comprehensive multi-sectoral strategies. However, the price tag to achieve this inclusive agenda is estimated at $5 to $7 trillion, with the projected investment gap in the developing countries is around $2.5 trillion. Allison's work on taxation as a mechanism for addressing this investment gap would be of great interest for this conversation. Economic justice is critical for realization of the promise of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which promised dignity to all 70 years ago. With this backdrop, I turn to my colleagues who will help us understand the complexities and complex barriers which confront when we talk about realization of economic justice in various parts of the world. So I will turn to my colleague John, and first of all, I'd like us to know how John got interested in the discipline of development geography, and why particularly your interest in working in conflict and post-conflict countries.
Thank you. I guess my first interest in development geography started with geography, and I was interested in, of course, different parts of the world and how they function. That sort of led me into wildlife conservation, and then I sort of had a yearning for the big perplexing questions of the world, which Nandini has articulated very well. And so I guess I'm drawn to the puzzles of the more intractable types of questions and problems, and so that leads me to the development problems in a conflict or war-affected context. So following that, I did my dissertation in Mozambique, just following the war there, and belonged to the Mozambican Land Commission that was charged with coming up with a new land law that sought to address some of the causes of that war, which were unequal land rights. From there, I've continued my interest in that, and have been amazed at how many different big questions, big perplexing questions that that issue of land rights in particular has been able to touch on.
Thank you. And Allison, why tax? Of all possible areas of law, why you chose to pursue tax and taxation?
Is there something more interesting than tax? There is not, I think. Thanks for that question. And I think you actually nailed it when you laid out the state of the world and the things we want and the challenges to get them. Because I think that's why I'm interested in tax. That's how I got into it. When I went to law school, I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I thought that I was interested in justice, global issues, distribution amongst different populations. And when I went to tax class, I realized, oh, you know, this is where these things get decided. Who's going to pay, and what are we going to use the money for, and who's going to decide that? And so I was interested in that, in the sort of cultural, social dynamics of tax. So you can see it in every political race. Tax is a big thing. Should we cut them? Should we raise them? Should we raise them on this population or that? Should we spend them on roads and infrastructure or fancy things like IT, you know, tech initiatives and so on? And so when I continued my work and got in, I worked in law firm and I did multinational deals, and I realized, you know, these questions that we have for our society, well, what should we use our tax dollars on? Well, they just get magnified on the global stage because, of course, now it's a race between countries to have the tax for them to do our projects and not share with other countries. And so there's this sort of battle for the scarce resource to invest in public goods for the better of who? And I think that's, you know, it's so fascinating to me when you talk about land rights and we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals articulating things that we have for 70 years. it's a shocking number, really. Like, why aren't we there, right? And I think, why are we not there? Because these things cost money, and we have to decide who should bear the cost and who will get the benefit. And we just can't agree on that. We really struggle. And when we struggle enough that the resources become the most important thing, then we have these conflicts. So I think I just would follow your path. That is, you get interested in this puzzle. And I got interested in the money piece of it. Just who's got it and how do I get it for the thing I think needs to be done.
So John, land, your work is around land in war-affected settings. What's the role of land rights? What's the role of property rights in realizing dignity and justice, particularly in turbulent regions, which are emerging out of the ashes of conflicts?
Certainly, yeah. A fundamental question. As a geographer, we're interested in spatial problems, the where question. Where across the landscape, the globe, do certain phenomenon happen? Land rights is one of these phenomena. It's particularly tricky because rights to land are unlike rights to a bicycle or to a piece of clothing or something, in that land outlives all owners. So as a spatial phenomenon, rights to that land is a very interesting thing to consider. Turbulent regions are also a spatial exercise, like land rights are. So I have rights to land, it's about rights to space somewhere. Conflict in any form is also about that, because we're all subject to gravity. We are all stuck on Earth somewhere. And so rights to where we are and where we think we should be and where we would like to exclude others from are at the forefront of different forms of turbulence and disputes and conflicts, all the way up to armed conflict, even when the armed conflict is in itself explicitly over land. It must occur over space, and so therefore disrupts the relationships of people about land. And so these two things are completely intertwined, forms of conflict and land and property rights. To the degree that when a conflict is over, what we see are two things. First, when the conflict is brought to an end, it's not like the two sides, or 5 or 20 sides, however there are, suddenly like each other, suddenly are peaceful. The hatred's still there, the initial grievances are still there, and so usually we find that when the shooting stops, the conflict switches to conflicts over land and property rights. The structures of those rights, how they're structured, the land registries, the titles, the deeds, the laws, are of course in complete disarray. Because the conflict has completely reworked the relationships about land, and many things are no longer functioning. At the same time, of course, this is called an open moment, if you will, when people are able to exercise land rights that they would not have been able to otherwise. Fraud, for example, or exercising your grandfather's claim from 50, 20, maybe 200 years ago. So all of the claims that are historical come out of the woodwork and assert themselves after a conflict in a context where law has really collapsed and rule of law is still an ongoing project. So rebuilding that then is quite a trick after a conflict. And I could go on forever.
Yeah. And we'll have a lot of time. Allison, George Bush Sr. recently passed away, and one of the things which has come back in the press is his famous claim saying, "Read my lips, I will no new taxes,"
Yeah.
in his election campaign. Tax is highly political, particularly in the context of United States, where you have taught and worked for a long time, and inequalities. When we look at the OECD countries, United States is which inequalities are really extreme. So what's the role of taxation in addressing the issue of inequalities? And I would flip the question for you, is what's the role in contributing to these inequalities, which are increasingly growing in the global north, in the OECD countries, but in parts of lower income context?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think reading "Read My Lips, No New Taxes" is maybe one of the least egregious things that former President Bush did in the world, but it was something that cost him, I think politically cost him, and there's a good reason. It's always easier. The easy story is cutting taxes. That's easy. We should cut taxes, great idea. What's hard is to understand that there's public investment in structures, in infrastructure. It's not just roads and bridges and the electricity grid. It's the rule of law. It's this fundamental building block that makes us a society, and it requires maintenance. It requires a lot of maintenance, and that costs money. And so you have to raise that money. And the question is, if I can get you to pay all of it, why would I volunteer? If I can get you to pay and I don't pay, then I can have more money to do other things that I want to do, which are consumptive in nature for me or my family. And if you have to pay for things that I can use and I can free ride, I'm going to do that all day long. So there's this basic problem, right? That we all agree we should have strong rule of law. We should have good institutions. We should have some way to resolve conflicts that doesn't end up in utter destruction. But we can't agree who should pay for that. And no matter what rule we create, we know the more sophisticated will hire, unfortunately, lawyers and accountants to help them not pay their fair share, not contribute as much as the next person. And so governments find themselves in this position. To get people to vote for you, you have to promise them tax cuts. To get people to vote for you, you have to say, we won't impose any burdens on you. But you also have to give them the society they want. Otherwise, they will recreate that society for themselves without government and then undermine the social fabric. And that, I think, is exactly what we see with inequality. So where there's greater inequality, and you'll see this in many places, I'm sure you have seen this in your travels, John, that the rich hive themselves off. They build walls around their homes. They have private security. They have private roads. They have private government, what you would consider government functions, schools, water supply, electricity. They have private arrangements. And the poor are left outside the gates. Yeah? And so that creation of that division means that the rich no longer want to pay for those institutions that are not within their walled compound. And so that wall has to get higher and higher as the people outside the wall are facing more and more deprivation until there's just no more room to live together. And I think that's where we see this cycle, right? When you get that huge inequality where the rich are so wealthy, they could pay, they could build a society that works for everyone. But it's simply not in their best interest, their own personal financial interest to do that until the society that they've created, which is this unequal society, fully collapses. And then even then, sometimes, it doesn't matter. The rich will come through that conflict and still be fine on the other side. So I think that inequality thing is really tough, right? We know we want to live in a society where we don't have people dying in the streets. We don't have children undernourished. We don't want to have that. But when we have to decide how we're going to prevent that and who is going to have to be responsible, whenever we have that conversation, it's just so much easier to get elected by saying, read my lips, no new taxes, than it is to say, read my lips, no more people dying homeless in the gutter. And you get to pay for that. You know, you're just really hard to get people, I think, to agree to that. And I would just add, I'm sure it's not a great mystery, that the things that government like to spend money on, the stuff that politicians like to spend money on, are big splashy projects. They're not fixing the roof, fixing the road, you know, doing basic rule of law maintenance. These are not exciting things. You don't want to do them at your house. You want to spend your money on the marble sink fixture, not on the new roof that no one is ever going to look at, and government functions on the same principle, and so we always have to convince ourselves. Tax is an investment. It's not a cost. It's not throwing down the toilet. It's not wasted. No, it's an investment in this society that we're trying to build together to prevent that utter chaos of total collapse. This is not an easy thing, and we haven't figured it out. Not just 70 years, but 700 years, 7,000 years. We haven't figured out how to do it the right way.
At least City of Montreal is trying to build and invest in public infrastructure. As we can see with the construction, it took us a while to come here.
Exactly.
So John, you have really a rich area of experiences in so many countries in the context of post-conflict. And countries have different arrangements of landholding and property regimes. What are some approaches to land and property restitutions in the context of transitional justice, which you have seen? Have you seen some good practices out of that? Are they transferable to countries emerging out of recent conflicts?
Well, that's of course the question, the goal. Are the best practices transferable to others? It's difficult to experiment with what would be a best practice, what would be a good approach to restitution. If you find a best practice, it's usually because you've stumbled across it, because it's happened and it happens to go well. At the same time, you realize mistakes only after they've been made, and then you hope to not repeat those again. What we're finding, though, in after a conflict or any large-scale problem, it can be a natural disaster, it can be a disastrous policy, is that we have so many cases of land and property claims, and they're so varied that it becomes difficult for the in-place domestic judicial system to handle these. So if we roll into a country after a conflict, and even just before the conflict, and you start to see what percentage of cases in all courts, not just civil courts, but all courts in a country that have to deal with land and property rights, it's usually upwards of 80 or 90%, which means that an enormous host of cases are not being heard. And so you can have a judicial system kind of seize up because there are just so many disputes and conflicts and claims over land rights. Fast forward to after a war, when you've increased enormously the number of claims that occur. People return home and someone else is in their house. So they have to go live in someone else's house, and then those people return home and they can't get into their home. And so they live somewhere else. And so you can have a large area that itself seizes up in terms of who goes where. And to start to get into there and untangle that is more difficult than trying to have a process for returns in the first place that has the right people going back into their housing land and property. We see a big problem is what we call secondary occupation. In other words, you go home, someone's in your house, and you can't get them to leave. Maybe they're with the opposing side in the conflict. Maybe your house has been confiscated from you and sold to them without you knowing, which is a popular revenue-generating trick that ISIS did, particularly in Iraq. So that is a good faith purchaser. You are out your house. The bad faith seller is gone. What to do? The person won't leave. You have no real ability, and usually when people return home after a conflict, they return before institutions do. And so there is no robust rule of law yet. There are no institutions that you can go to and say, please get this person out of my house. What do you do? It's a war, and so like in most all wars, society sort of withdraws into fractured pieces. Okay, and so you belong to one of those pieces, and there's usually a militia or some armed aspect to that. So to get to that person out of your house, you default to your armed kin or your own ethnic group, etc., to help you out. That's the institution that you go to resolve your land problem, because rule of law is slower than the returning refugee or the returning internally dislocated person. So a lot of attention is being placed on that. How do we move quick enough to get back either before or with returning populations, and so they understand what their options are, their legal options, their eviction options, their compensation options, et cetera, so that they feel some form of justice, economic justice, is within their grasp. If it's not, they will exercise their own set of options. And so we multiply that times the number of times that it happens, and in today's wars, that's in the hundreds of thousands, and in cases like Syria, it will be in the millions of claims. Claims for people who want their house back, their farm back, but also people who want compensation for damage and destruction and for not being able to go back because it's been, the area's been reworked ethnically. They'll want alternative lands, they want money. So there's all sorts of ways to make a claim. And the problem is this, if these are not addressed, if these grievances regarding land and property are not addressed, they actually don't go away over the generations. They actually become more acute and they multiply. So that you have one claimant in one generation experiences 2 or 3 generations. Now the descendants of that one claimant are many. And in certain societies, they all have a claim back to that original grievance. So dealing with large scale housing, land, and property rights, mass claims, we call them, after a conflict is a large scale social justice endeavor that operates on fear. Well, what is the fear if we don't attend to these large-scale grievances as soon as possible? They grow, they fester, they frequently become the cause for the next war. And so there's a great deal of effort and interest now in attending to mass claims. And so the question becomes, what are the techniques and the technologies involved in dealing with enormous numbers of claims all at the same time? Right now we're tending toward being able to come up with ways to categorize large numbers of claims into certain categories of types. And then a single legal ruling is passed for that type with regard to what's provided as a remedy. It's the land back, it's compensation, it's alternative land, it's your children in the best school, it's you in line to get a job when the reconstruction happens. There's a variety of remedies that are being experimented with in terms of laying to rest a claim. Sometimes this can be pretty rough justice because usually you always have to have a line, a date, by which you do not entertain claims if the claim is connected to an event before the date. This can be a little difficult because many wars come on the heels of other wars. And if you say, okay, only during this war are we entertaining claims, that means people from previous wars cannot submit a claim. That might be neat and tidy on paper, but in fact, wars are connected to other wars and dislocations are connected to previous dislocations. So you've got a bit of a line of dominoes and you can't really stop one from falling against the next. So drawing that line as a date is always an injustice to a good number of people who can become very unhappy and very aggrieved. The idea there is that date is a technique. It's a way to reduce the volume of claims, and that's always a searching idea, how to reduce the volume of claims, but at the same time be inclusive and provide social justice. So it's an interesting transitional justice problem that we're dealt with, a robust area of research, not just legal research, but human geography research as well, in terms of what types of claims are people going to be satisfied with regard to the landscape. Sometimes it gets a little heavy-handed. Earlier, Iraq had a way to compensate all claimants. It's 20% of the value of your property, take it or leave it. And so that's a little interesting. So those that are desperate enough will take it. Those that think, you know, my claim's outstanding, it's still going to be alive if I don't take it, so no, I won't take that offer, and my claim is still alive. And so my children will know that my claim is still alive. That cultivates a grievance, particularly if it's among a large population, that becomes very difficult and very expensive to deal with. And of course, the large travesty it becomes very, very unjust.
Thank you. So it's, as you say, that land being tied to livelihood, land has sentimental attachment, land has identity attachments, and could, if not dealt with land claims could lead to a vicious cycle of conflict. In the similar vein, there is a vicious cycle of deprivation and denial of opportunities in the countries where it should not be there, but particularly in lower income and lower middle income countries. And you had mentioned the role of tax in realizing economic justice through investment in public goods, creating a level playing field for all. But who collects taxes is the state. And in most parts of the world, the trust in state is very weak. The state has not done its job well to have elicited trust from its people. So my question to you is twofold. One, what are some contemporary ways, new ways in which taxation has been used to work towards realizing greater economic equalities? And what role you think state plays and state ought to play in reinforcing trust in its apparatus so that people would pay taxes and they would believe that the money I pay to you will be spent the way I want you to spend, or the promise you've made to me that you will spend it this way, that it won't go to your bank account.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question, isn't it? Yeah. So I think the first thing to note is that you actually don't have to have a great amount of trust in order to get tax from people. You can extract a lot of it whether people trust in you or not, if you have the right tools. I mean, that's the sort of sovereign power at work. I would prefer if governments were trustworthy. I have not yet met a government that's trustworthy here or anywhere else. So we have to work with that imperfection, that governments are flawed. Right? The people who make spending decisions are flawed. The people who do procurement contracts, oh my goodness, I'm sure you've seen this. That's a flawed process. So there's a lot of flaws. So we have to work with that. We have to start from that position that people are going to misuse some amount of funds. And we can't wait for things to be perfect. We cannot wait for perfect transparency and accountability. What we have to do, though, is say that the legitimacy of the state does depend on trying to get better at transparency and accountability. And you know who's really good at demanding transparency and accountability? People who pay taxes. The more they pay, the more they tend to demand. And the more ability they have to demand, the more they tend to be able to influence the direction of the government. Now, this can be bad in the sense that you can have capture, and it can be good in the sense that you can have momentum. And so let's look at it. I think you asked for a contemporary example. I think, you know, for me, I'm really focused on international. So my focus is going to be on an international example, but I think we could probably bring it down to a more national level if we think it through a little bit. But I look at the Sustainable Development Goal program right now, the 2030 agenda, right? By 2030, we have 17 Sustainable Development Goals. We're supposed to be making progress toward all of them. And one of the things that is clear embedded in this process is that domestic resource mobilization is the strategy. That is, what do we mean by that? This is the verb, like some verbiage here, but what it means is domestic, like countries themselves have to figure out how to get the money to spend on these goals. It can't be some international organization or some external organization, you know, coming up with the money and then funding the projects and then, you know, sending in teams of assessors to see if the projects were done. It can't be that model. It has to be, there has to be some autonomy. There has to be some agency of the countries that want development in this. And so we see a little shift here, away from the old model of the international financial organizations coming up with the money, coming up with the projects, imposing tax ideals, imposing conditions on loans and so on. We're seeing a change, right? In the Sustainable Development Goals, we're seeing domestic resource mobilization. So the idea is, Yes, we have all of these problems. We have all of this lack of trust, but we don't have a choice. We have to let governments work out their relationship with their people. We have to do that, and they have to be in charge of their own spending. We can't come in from the outside and say, you've got to spend on this and you've got to spend on that. What we can do is try to get the money in the hands of the decision makers, and then also at the same time, like look at the other parts of the SDGs, at the same time put pressure on the places where lack of trust is endemic, right, in institutional areas of government. So we can have NGOs putting pressure for more accountability, for more transparency, for publication of procurement contracts or bidding, explaining the process for bidding for contracts and making sure that people who are profiting from, chaos, that their names are known, that they don't get away with that. Really working to prevent international monetary, financial flows, illicit financial flows is what some people call them, right? So there's all of those pieces. But there's the core here, that there has to be a fundamental belief that the people who raise the money really have the right to decide what they should spend that money on. And it builds on itself. And so there's an internal process that tax should foster, which is that the more people pay tax, the more they will demand that accountability. Now, I think that it's important, though, to step back and say, okay, that's fine. Sure, we're going to build some domestic resource mobilization, and sure, people are going to have autonomy. But they are so deprived that there's not that much to work with. There's not that much revenue to work with. And why is that? And so you can go, the economists will tell us about, inequality between countries and the development paradoxes, and they will study these things. But I have a different answer, right? My answer is, well, look at the international tax system we've created. The international tax system we created creates a vicious cycle. You talked about a vicious cycle over here, and I think here we see another one, and we've got to figure out where to put ourselves in it. So what's the cycle? The cycle is this. If you're a low-income country, then what you produce in global supply chains are low-value inputs. You have low-paid labor, you have regulatory flexibility, so you don't charge companies for the kind of environmental damage they might do, or you might give them free zones where you provide property or electricity or water access that other companies might not have, and you don't charge them for that. So companies come and they take advantage of the lack of development. They take advantage of that lack of development to build value in their supply chain. But tax follows commerce. Where you have a low value input, then you are also attributed less of the profit of that global enterprise, which means you have less to tax. So if we're talking about domestic resource mobilization, if you just have small inputs, small value inputs, then you're assigned a small portion of the profit on the global basis. Then you have very little to tax, which means you have less to spend, invest to develop the things that create more value, and we start that cycle again. So where can we go, right? There's all kinds of places where people in labor rights can try to stop that vicious cycle by making sure that labor is paid at least a living wage. People who are interested in environmental protection can go in and try to stop the cycle by making sure that externalities are priced into the production of goods, right? And I come in as the tax person, I say, okay, I think I can insert myself where the international community has sort of built its tax system on an economic idea about where value is produced and in what quantities, and just tweak that to align it with the Sustainable Development Goals. To say, look, that development discount, the reason that you go and avail yourself of low-paid labor and low regulatory obligations, that creates a value which currently is wholly attributed to rich countries. All of that profit goes to rich countries. It goes to the shareholders of companies that exploit those value differentials. So we should change that, right? In line with the Sustainable Development Goals, we could change that. In line with the rules we have, we can say those two regimes, countries have have articulated a commitment to both. They say they want to cooperate on international tax, and they say they want to achieve the SDGs. So we've got to figure out a way that they can fit together. I have my own ideas, but I think this has to be collaborative. We need economists, geographers, accountants, lawyers, development experts of all kinds, and especially from countries that are supposed to be making these priorities, trying to figure out what to spend on. They have to be active in this. They can't be people who are told this is what you're going to do. They have to tell the rest of the world what needs to happen. So I think it's a collaborative process, but it starts from that dedication that you have to start with an imperfect system. We have to work with this within the chaos of imperfection.
Right,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
But there is the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Oh yeah.
And many states in the world are in the last category.
Mm-hmm.
And you talked about we need to work within the paradigm, and I think it's a good good way to go. Except we need to find the way to nudge the political will. Mm-hmm. And using the nudge concept, which is a very economic concept, how do you nudge the political will? And what incentives you create and what disincentives you create, right? So it's about thinking in terms of global solidarity, which is what the 2030 agenda is about. With that, and I just wanted to come back to the trust. Yes, it's not 100% trust, but there are so many states which are kleptocratic. I mean, essentially, you've stolen state assets and everything you could. And the tax base is not there for that reason, and for the other reason being the state does not have the capacity to raise taxes. But clearly, I would come back to the issue of economic justice and the bottom billion, paraphrasing Paul Collier, and that bottom billion is in the countries you work in, many conflict and post-conflict countries, which is people who are suffering extreme economic and social deprivation. Mm-hmm. And the state is weak, as you said, in some contexts it's failed or failing. And what are some of the difficulties or barriers you have seen in your work in accessing justice? And we can open it a little broader, economic justice indeed, because I do believe that it is critical to realize economic justice in order to realize the promises of fundamental freedoms. Mm-hmm. Unless you have food, shelter, security, physical and economic security, you can't do much else. So with that, what are some of the barriers or challenges you come across in your work?
Mm-hmm. That bottom billion has, it's been calculated in the form of what Hernando de Soto would call dead capital. Contains in their property, their physical assets, their land assets, more money than all of the expenditures for international development in the history of the world. So, trillions of dollars are in this dead capital sort of state, locked up in even the smallest shanty and the smallest slum dwelling. And so this notion of dead capital is most effectively applied in the large slums of the developing world, much less so among intact land and property rights system in indigenous and customary rural areas. And that's because once you move from an intact land rights system into one of these slum areas, you've left behind that land and property rights system and entered into another one. You become sort of a settler, and you have to deal with the property mafia. And the bottom issue in this billion and in the trillions that are locked up in their dead capital is what we call tenure in security, right? Land and property rights, tenure in security, and basically it works like this. For example, us today, we are secure in our land and property holdings. So secure that we feel good enough about leaving our home, and coming in and doing other things with our lives, pursuing a job, going to school, etc. For many that live in such circumstances, the acutely tenure insecure, they can't do that. If they leave their house, their slum dwelling, they're not assured that their things will still be there, even if there's a lock on the door. They're not assured that somebody else won't be there. And if there is, there's no one for them to go to and say, please get this person's out. So the issues of trust are large. This idea of having a claim to a property and being secure in your claim, it has much more to do than just the title or the deed. Those are just artifacts of a system, along with the registry and your landlord and everything else. And a great deal to do with trust in society. Does the rest of society recognize your claim as legitimate, and therefore will just walk by your house and not just break the door in and go and occupy your land and property? So that's something we take for granted. Most of us, we get up, we depart our abodes, and we go about our day, and then when we return, we fully expect that door to be locked, regardless of how flimsy that lock may be, and for everybody to have respected our claim. So if you're in this bottom billion, that doesn't apply. And that's kind of the problem. You cannot depart your home. You can't even go down to the street corner and beg, right? Because your accommodations are so tenure insecure. So somebody in your family always has to be there, right? And even then it's fairly precarious, right? So this idea of how do we take that? How do we take all of the potential capital that's there in all these properties and mobilize it, get it into the land and property market so that there's collateral, there's movement, there's buying and selling, and that sort of thing. So there's been some really good theorizing and some really good connecting of the dots on paper about how to do that. In reality, you would have to break the hold of what are called property mafias in these large slum dwellings where the bottom billion is most present. That's a tough thing to do. That property mafia doesn't own the property; they just exert armed control over that. And so I know Kenya has had a particular difficulty in trying to break the hold of the property mafia so that it can go in and actually give legitimate title to all the many small holders so that they can start to do something with that title. But that's a tough go. And I know Brazil also has an interesting experience with trying to do this. Egypt, a much more successful experience following on Lima, Peru, which has tried to move forward with titling and documenting and registering in a very quick way ownership and occupation of all of these many small properties that the bottom billion lives in. So some successes somewhere, some problems others, and so there is this opportunity, if you will, to try to move this bottom billion. Of course, this just is the analysis within the land and property rights domain. In economics, I'm sure there's other opportunities, but the large scale sort of hurdles to doing this mostly are with government. So in places in the world where it's most difficult, where this conundrum is most complicated, there are many steps, most of them insurmountable, that it would take for a small property holder to actually register their property. Before our friend Hernando de Soto did this in Lima, Peru, he found 700 steps between a small property owner and actually getting it registered. Takes years, takes money, takes literacy, all things that usually this bottom billion find in short supply. So to clean that up is a large and very worthwhile endeavor and stands out as a large constraint, I would say.
Thank you. De Soto is very interesting. His work as value of capital is very interesting. His work on trust is a very interesting one, but he also has come under a lot of criticism from the human rights community that his simplistic solution of titling land and that is contrary to inheritance right, customary rights, etc., etc. But I absolutely agree with you that there is this dead potential which need to be realized. With that in mind, and you mentioned something about education and other elements in short supply among bottom billion. And that brings me back to the state and taxes. So going back to Sen and Nussbaum about capabilities, that state simply has to create an enabling environment for each individual to realize their own potential. So individuals' agency needs to be enforced, and state has to create that. So investment in public goods and investment in opportunities for its citizens. And how the state does it is one route is through raising money through taxation, not the only route, but one more important route to it. So what are the challenges you see in your work as taxation is the route to address economic injustices? What barriers the state encounters, and you've already alluded to so many issues which different stakeholders are concerned about when it comes to taxes. Why should I trust the state? Mm-hmm. What are some of the concerns you have?
Well, it's really interesting, and I appreciate this account of this vulnerability of your home. This is our basic thing that you rely on to not be able to leave it and go out because you think it might not be there when you come back. It seems so basic, right? It's so basic that you just got to get that fixed, right? No matter what the challenge is, you just have to fix that. And yet, it's just maddening in terms of the sort of the technical way that you have to get that done. You said 700 steps. Why does that happen? And so I think this is where I would say there's some parallel here going into this very, I would think, remote place as compared to this home. So in my field, I think the big challenge is not even so much the technical rules at the domestic level. It's that there's this global system that has developed that rich countries really have created for themselves over the last, let's say, same amount, 70 years or so. And that it has become so natural. Like, oh, this is how we do international cooperation on trade and on tax. This is how we do it. We do it with these institutions, we do it with these actors, we do it through these processes. And so we get the same answer all the time because we keep going through the same people with the same expertise for the same process, and we get the same answer, and we can't seem to break out of that. We seem to just keep coming back to this basic problem that everyone agrees we should fix, but we can't somehow get past all of the problems. So I think for me, the problem of the development and developing trust and so on, it starts when we decide that it's okay to do business with a kleptocratic state. That's okay. That's fine. We can have transactions, we can do business, we can have trade and commerce with kleptocratic states. But somehow we can't give them autonomy. We cannot give them agency to raise taxes. We can do business with them, but we can't give them an equal say in international decisions about where tax should fall. And to me, I think that's a pretty structural problem, and that is a tough one, because of course they're bad actors, but so are the rich countries who profit from that relationship, who say, yeah, that's okay if there's a kleptocrat in charge. They get to say, if you can get control over a contested territory, that's yours now. You can dole it out. You can sell it to the highest bidder, and we will respect that contract, and we will allow people to go in and extract resources and do whatever projects they're going to do, because there's money to be made, and we're going to make it. And so I think for me, the challenge of trust, of getting the money in the right hands and so on, all those challenges are that we have accepted a world in which profit making is actually accepted, even when we see all those flaws. But supporting self-governance, we just simply can't accept it. We feel we have to control it. We can't allow people to have more access to resources if they're going to do X, Y, and Z with it. That, I think, is a structural problem. If we had another hour, I would lay it all out for you, and then I would propose how we could change it. And then what you would say is, after that hour, you would say, that's all fine, but no one's going to agree to that, and that's the challenge. That is it. You cannot get people to agree with a system that will take away profit from their own and control from their own hands. And that's the challenge. Someone has a benefit from the system we have. How do you get them to give it up? How do you do that? And that's a challenge. That's a challenge everywhere in all levels of governance. And for me, the challenge is in tax. And I think when I listen to what you're telling me about land, I think it must be the same, that someone benefits from having it be this way. And we somehow accept the things that make that person continue to be able to benefit. And that we've got to attack that from every possible angle. So I'll come in and pretend that it's all about tax. I'll try to convince you all it's all about tax, but it's not. I'll come in and I'll do the tax side. We also need absolutely strong oversight from the NGO community. We need private sector to be aware of their role that they're playing. We need to be thinking about where the profit ends up when people have their rights taken away, who benefits from that, who profits from that. And when it's us, we should be willing to say, oh, yeah, we are profiting from that, and we're not comfortable with that. We want our governments to make a different choice. We're not going to just simply accept it as, well, it's so hard and so complicated. It's not me taking that person's home away. It's not my fault that the person can't leave their house and go to work. But if I continue to benefit from that situation, then I think I have to take some responsibility. At least say, I refuse to profit from it. I don't want to profit from that situation. And so it's a challenge. It's a challenge, but it's a theoretical challenge. It's a momentum challenge. It's a challenge of thinking about things the right way and having people be able to speak to their own experiences and make sure that you know, hey, you know what? You're profiting from my misery. You don't have to. You could choose not to. And we should be trying to point those things out.
So we have a few minutes to have our concluding remarks as we go along, and I will take this opportunity to share with you what dominates my consciousness. So it's not that top 1% owning 45% of the wealth bothers me that much. Yes, it's extreme, it's unjust, but what really dominates my thinking is extreme deprivation, which people are suffering in 2018. In a world which has all which you need, and yet 1 billion, and I think more than 1 billion, face on a daily basis precarity and extreme deprivation. And I keep going back to Sen's quote about the world will not be a perfectly just place, as you have just said. However, it is our moral obligation to work to remove extreme forms of injustices. So therefore, I don't talk in terms of paradigm shift, right? Because I know in other human rights areas where theoretically the paradigm has shifted, but in reality it has not shifted. Because in reality, there is political economy, there is political will, it's hegemonic, we know that. So with that in mind, from your perspective, what do you think your work is contributing to address some of these extreme injustices which people in conflict and post-conflict countries endure?
I think for me, one of the most profound injustices are for the forced displacement of very large numbers of people, and then of course where they end up and how they end up, but then of course in their return. That return to their houses, land, and properties is always difficult. If you're the person that goes back and walks back into the front door of that house and everything is as you left it, then good for you. Most people don't have that luxury, and so then what? So that's a form of injustice that as I noted earlier, grows over time. It doesn't stop when the aggrieved person passes away. There are descendants that take that injustice and that grievance on. And so if not attended to, that grievance grows, multiplied by the number of times that it happens, and you have a very, very large problem. It can become very acute over time. The Palestine-Israeli problem is a particular example of this, over land and property, that has grown very acute over time and has involved more and more people that weren't even alive at the initial dislocation. And so we see this go on. And so that growing set of grievances, I think for me is one of the bigger injustices.
Thank you. And Allison, last word to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I would echo your concern for this basic deprivation, right? How is that possible when we know we have the resources, and everywhere you go, you can say there is some capacity, there is some maneuverability room there, you could do better, right? And I think the setting of goals, like the 2030 Agenda is a goal setting. It's an exercise in saying, okay, we agree that a certain level of deprivation is intolerable. We just agree with that. And that's basic. It is not fancy. It is not probably sufficient, but it's the baseline. So the setting of goals tells me that we recognize we have built a world that has created deprivation and that we need to resolve it. And so for me, the difficulty and the thing that really gets me going is that we in the global north benefit. We benefit financially from that deprivation. We benefit because we go and exploit the labor, the environment, and the resources of places that are vulnerable. And the profits come home to us, to our pension funds. We take that. We take that deprivation and we profit from it. That really bothers me. I don't know what the solution is for a specific country in a specific situation. I don't know what that government should do because that's not my government. That's not my choice. But what I do know is that every decision that has been made to take autonomy away from that government, to say the rule set is somewhere else, to me is accepting the deprivation and the bad outcomes because I profit from it. And that I find intolerable. Even though I know I can't change that. I can't change that, we can't change that. But I think that I still every day wake up and think, to the extent that any part of my life is made easier because someone is suffering, I have to say that's a problem and try to resolve it. And you know what? Most of my life is made easier because of somebody else's suffering. From the clothes I wear, to the food I eat, to the transportation, to the building materials, to the electrical devices, the device in my, well, not currently in my pocket. All of those things that benefit me, that make my life rich and full, are built on the misery of others. And I cannot change that misery, but I have a really technical, boring, rule set that I know something about. Tax. And I can go into that conversation and say, if all of those things are intolerable, there are some things, some small things that we can do to tweak our rule set to just tip the scale a little bit more in the favor of the country where that kind of deprivation is taking place. And it won't be enough. It will not be enough, but it will be a tiny little bit more than it was yesterday. And then I will feel a little bit better. And maybe we'll get some momentum and the dam will open, the dam will break and the floodgates will open and we will rethink the compromises that we've made up until now. It's just a small, it's a modest.
Thank you. Thank you for that really inspiring moment. And I hope that we'll reconnect in 2022 in the middle of the year, which will be the halfway mark for the Agenda 2030 to have this conversation once again. And with that, I thank you very much for a stimulating hour. And I invite all of you to go to mcgill.ca/human rights to see the dialogues on human rights and legal pluralism. There are 9 of them, including ours. So thank you and good afternoon.